Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final installment of this fall's Lunchtime Lecture series. My name is Daniel John Mitchell. I'm the director of the Center for Historical Research at the Science History Institute and your host for today. If you're new to our Lunchtime Lecture series, what we do is have a 40-minute or so lecture, and then we turn things over to you to ask questions of our speaker. And if you want to do that, you just have to make sure that you're logged in through your Google account, and then you can type questions into the chat window on YouTube. If you have any trouble with that, or you'd prefer just to use email, you're welcome to email us at lunchtimelectures@sciencehistory.org. We'll put that email in the comments for you so that you have it to hand for later. So let me now introduce our speaker, Tiffany Nichols. She earned a BS in electrical engineering and a JD at the University of Virginia, and then went on to a career in law, where she specialized, among other things, in intellectual property litigation. She also held positions at the RAND Corporation and the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. She's now a doctoral candidate in the Department of the History of Science at Harvard University and a graduate student affiliate at Harvard's Black Hole Initiative, an interdisciplinary research center that focuses on the study, of course, of black holes. Now, the image of a physicist, Tiffany points out, is generally one of someone in deep thought at a chalkboard or laboring away in their lab. And you might, cultural images, for example, photographs of Feynman and Einstein might spring to mind standing in front of a blackboard. But by taking the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, LIGO, as a case study, Tiffany's PhD project explores the various other roles that physicists, both theorists and experimentalists, fulfill in order to launch and run their research endeavors that don't fall within this stereotypical image. She argues that nowadays physicists must become well-versed in government policy, community building, international relations, and business negotiations. Her talk today looks more closely at the LIGO site selection and its impact upon how physicists and engineers understood what is a genuine gravitational wave signal and what is merely noise generated by the instrument, its location, and surrounding environment. Now, Tiffany, this is really recent science, isn't it? I think it's coming up to the 5th anniversary, I think, of the announcement that LIGO had detected a genuine gravitational wave signal.
Yes, that's the case. I am very pleased to talk to all of you today about my doctoral research. So thank you to the Science History Institute for the invitation, and we will get started with the presentation. So one of the interesting things about my work in the area of the history and philosophy of physics is that I get to observe what physicists do. And doctoral research takes a very long time, so I've been observing physicists for a while. This allows me to see aspects of their work in the lab and also outside of the lab. So I thought that I would focus on the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, or LIGO, and explore these issues through this talk entitled Beyond the Lab, the Role of Experimental and Theoretical Physicists in this site selection of LIGO. So this talk will be organized with some technical background, and then we will focus on the consideration of one candidate location for LIGO to explore the many hats that physicists must wear to launch a big science collaboration. I argue by shifting focus from just the lab, or the stereotypical image of the physicist, to where the lab should be sited allows other activities to come into focus. So around 6 a.m. Eastern Time on September 14th, 2015, at each of the twin LIGO laboratories in remote areas of the United States, a team of physicists and engineers received an unexpected signal. Some have been awaiting evidence of the most violent events in our universe, such as the merger of two massive black holes, for over 10 years, and others for over 40. As members of the collaboration around the world began reviewing their emails about the alert, they realized that this aberration was not an unwanted glitch, but it was the signal that they had been searching for, a gravitational wave resulting from the collision of two black holes 1.3 billion light years away. So gravitational waves deform or stretch and squeeze space-time, which is the very fabric that constitutes our universe. This signal showed that these two massive black holes circled each other, and as they moved closer and closer, they explosively merged into a single black hole, emitting energy in the form of a gravitational wave. And here's a simulation on how that merger may have looked if you could discern the black holes in the universe. So by the time gravitational waves reach the detectors, or they're called interferometers, at the Livingston, Louisiana, and Hanford, Washington LIGO sites, they are on the magnitude of 0.001%, the width of the diameter of a proton. In numerical notation, this is 10 to the negative 21. So gravitational waves are dimensionless because they represent a ratio of how space-time is deformed or warped as a gravitational wave propagates through the geometric fabric of our universe through the interferometer. So although Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity predicted their existence, he believed an instrument sensitive enough to detect such gravitational waves would never exist. And physicist Rainer Weiss, the founder and creator of LIGO, thought otherwise. So he believed that the unique properties of light could be harnessed to detect gravitational waves through the use of laser interferometry. Because gravitational waves deform space-time with an oscillating rhythm, he figured it would be possible to use the travel time of light to measure these oscillations. So Weiss selected laser interferometers. So now Naomi will show you a quick video with Ray Weiss explaining how the very large interferometers and the ones that are in existence at the actual sites have arms that are 2.5 miles long, are able to detect gravitational waves. So I'll turn it over to Naomi to show you this quick video.
To measure this stretching and squeezing, Ray turned to a device called an interferometer. A laser beam is split and sent down a pair of long perpendicular tubes, each precisely the same length. The two beams bounce off mirrors and recombine back at the base. The light waves come back lined up in such a way that they cancel each other out.
And you add them together, you get nothing. You get a zero, a big fat zero. No light gets detected at the photodetector.
But when a gravity wave comes along, it distorts space and changes the distance between the mirrors. One arm becomes a little longer, the other a little shorter. An instant later, they switch. This back and forth stretching and squeezing happens over and over until the wave has passed. As the distances change, so does the alignment between the peaks and valleys of the two returning light waves, and the light waves no longer cancel each other out when added together in the recombined beam. Now some light does reach the detector, with an intensity that varies as the distance between the mirrors varies. Measure that intensity, and you're measuring gravity waves.
The light takes longer time in here than it did in this arm. Now it takes a shorter time, and these things don't cancel so beautifully anymore.
Okay, so when thinking about where to place such instruments, LIGO physicists had to consider not only plot size, but also vibrations on the site. As with any engineering problem, each design choice has its positive and negative aspects. In the LIGO case, the length results in a highly sensitive instrument, but also makes it highly susceptible to noise. Any and all vibrations that can mask or mimic gravitational wave signals, including a train rumbling by, or an airplane flying over the site, or even wind pushing on the interferometer's concrete housing. So therefore, the instruments must be placed in locations that are seismically quiet and lack the daily vibrations of human activity. This was a notion that was known very early in the process, as Weiss had determined many of the noise sources that would affect the experiment by 1972 using pen and paper. So the arms must also be absolutely flat, as light travels in nearly a straight line here on Earth. Across the length of the 4 kilometers, or 2.5 1.5 miles, the Earth's surface curves about 1.3 meters downward. If these arms were not absolutely straight, they would miss their approximately 34 centimeter wide target. There are a few additional requirements, but they're not relevant to this talk, and I would be happy to go over them during Q&A. So considering what theoretical physicists do, we often conjure up the image of the chalkboard, but by focusing on what theoretical physicists do beyond the chalkboard is not entirely conventional. So usually we consider them using a chalkboard or pen and paper to formulate physical properties that are derived from first principles. And when we think about experimental physicists, we imagine them tinkering away at the instruments that provide the supporting evidence of the theories that the theorists developed. So for this talk, I will focus on Rainer Weiss, mostly part experimentalist, but he's also very much a part theorist. So all three of the physicists you see here, Barry Barish, Kip Thorne, Rainer Weiss, and others, all had to engage in activities falling outside of physics in order to establish LIGO and the LIGO that we have today. So after today, I hope your view of physicists shifts from not only including the Ray Weiss and the blue box, but also including the Ray Weiss in this photograph on the right. So that is, we have an experimental physicist in the lab winning a Nobel Prize, but we also have the same experimental physicist out in the community engaging in activities to find and secure a site that would ultimately become a potential candidate for a LIGO location. So the point I argue is that by looking at what physicists do beyond the lab, in addition to what they do in the lab, provides insights into how LIGO physicists formulated and refined aspects of their understanding of noise, which is key to obtaining the requisite sensitivity and the interferometers to detect gravitational waves. That is, how LIGO now interprets noise originates from theory, knowledge of the instruments, and also knowledge of their environment. So through the efforts of Ray Weiss and his early team, during the early 1980s, I will show how understanding site selection provides insights into LIGO's conceptualization of noise. One of the most popular sites considered by the MIT team, led by Weiss, was the Columbia, Maine site, and it's situated in the middle of Maine's Blueberry Barrens. And these efforts were done in 1984 to 1985 time period. The Columbia site is nestled near the coast in the heart of Maine's Blueberry Barren country. This area is the only part of the United States where wild blueberries, one of the few fruits indigenous to North America, grow. Unlike cultivated blueberries, which grow over 15 feet high, the wild blueberries grow from shrubs close to the ground. The undulating sandy terrain is perfect for the mile-long root networks of these wild blueberry shrubs. These extensive root networks allow for the shrubs to lay claim to the area and prevent transportation of bits and pieces of the plant to other areas. The low heights of the shrubs along the varying terrains preferred by the plants also prevent producers from mechanizing the process of harvesting blueberries, and this results in a relatively quiet process. Instead, blueberry rakes resembling a dustpan with teeth, and they were also invented nearby in Columbia Falls, Maine in the late 1800s, are still wielded by individuals, overwhelmingly by the Mi'kmaq, a First Nation people who migrate to Maine for blueberry harvest season from New Brunswick and Nova Scotia across the border in Canada into Maine. Harvesting these blueberries doesn't fit within the mechanized agricultural trends because their very nature prevents it. Apart from the brief period during the late summer and early fall, when these blueberries are harvested, the area appeared to offer an abundance of silence and stillness, which was ideal for LIGO. And even during harvest periods, without mechanization, it was also still very quiet in terms of thinking about background noise. So how was the site initially found? While Weiss and his team were building a prototype for the large-scale interferometer in 1984, Weiss sent a postdoctoral researcher, Peter Salson, to the MIT Hayden Library to review topology maps there. So mind you, Salson's primary role was to build a prototype for the gravitational wave detector. But in order to make a large-scale version feasible, there needed to be adequate sites meeting the criteria provided earlier. So Isaacson had to dive into new terrain and learn to decipher maps in order to accomplish this goal. Anyone based in the Boston metro area looking for a quiet site with enough space will naturally work their way up the coastline. And he found that the library's map coverage, unfortunately for Maine, was incomplete. So this prompted Weiss to inquire with the director of Maine's Bureau of Public Lands about whether he knew of any large flat sites. And here we see Weiss had learned not only gravitational wave physics and general relativity, but also how to gain knowledge about the sites themselves to find a site that was adequate for the needs of the interferometer. So in response, the Maine state geologist provided Weiss with several sites that had not been previously considered. These included Biddeford, Maine, which is outside of Kennebunkport, the Blueberry Barrens of Cherryfield, which is also interchangeably called Columbia, Maine, and the forest near Sappaquonic. All of these places were not quite right, except for the Blueberry Barrens. So by the winter of 1985, the LIGO team was satisfied enough with this potential cherry-filled location that they thought it was time to seriously investigate beyond the word-of-mouth concessions and knowledge gained by the maps. So in a document prepared for informing collaborators, university administration, and government officials about the LIGO project, the MIT described the site as follows: flat and dry, and has convenient access to power lines, which cross the site. The soil conditions would allow us to bury the facilities in a shallow trench so that the tubing would be out of the elements and the land above the tube would be restored to its original use, minimizing environmental impact. So notice that this understanding was based on the maps available to them. This will later change once they saw the sites in person. And when Weiss notified the real estate office at MIT about this project, they in turn provided him with the resources his team would need to secure the land. So this included protocols for acquiring land, an attorney, and partial funding for attorney's fees to purchase the land, and also secure title insurance. And if we look at this map here, you can imagine how Peter Isaacson would envision whether a site could accommodate the interferometer. So a lot of the maps that you find in the archives around this time have these L shapes drawn on them, and they represent the interferometer. And you could see how the physicists were spatially working with the maps to see if the interferometers would fit. So we have that going on. Also, along the way, we have another physicist, and at the time he was at the National Science Foundation as a program manager, and this is Richard Isaacson. And Richard Isaacson provided Weiss with guidance on how to foster support from government officials. He knew without governmental support, there would likely not be any local support in Maine. So a mini sidebar about Isaacson is illustrated through this cartoon drawn by another physicist. And Richard Isaacson is very pivotal in growing the gravitational field that we have today. So this included foreseeing the need for supercomputing technologies to develop waveform templates for LIGO and analysis of LIGO data, building consensus within a growing collaboration that would become one of the largest collaborations in physics history, and communicating and policy development with governmental actors. He also had a knack for understanding the many nuances of federal funding for fundamental science. And this is in addition to Isaacson finding that gravitational waves were not only a mathematical glitch produced by general relativity, but in fact, they were a physical phenomenon. So shifting back to Maine, a few months later, Weiss and his team traveled to the site in the summer of 1985. And they noticed that the site was not as flat as the maps and state officials had led them to believe. The maps had shown a lesser degree and number of changes in elevation across the parcel of interest. And as a result, the orientation of the interferometer would have to be adjusted. For example, one of the arms would have to be shifted to miss the granite upthrust that you can see on the right. And And this is an example of how maps can provide a vast amount of information, but often fail to provide the distinct needs of an idiosyncratic user. In this case, an understanding of the exact elevation fluctuation of the land that might affect the straightness of the interferometer arms across a 5-kilometer length. At the time that they were looking for the site, the arms were actually projected to be longer than they are today. So obtaining this kind of information required Weiss and his team to actually occupy and observe the land. So the next year, Weiss scheduled the yearly team outing to Cherryfield, Maine, including a hike through the mountains in the local state park nearby and a tour of the blueberry sites of interest. That year's announcement stated, "Visit fabulous Washington County, Maine. Plans are shaping up for the lab outing to visit the proposed gravity antenna. Accommodations have been arranged in Millbridge, and we are getting a carpool arrangement set too. A number of fantastic activities are under consideration for the weekend. One highlight, of course, will be the inspection and tour of the antenna site in Columbia. This lovely plateau covered with low bush blueberries looks south to the coast and north to the Great Heath, one of the largest peat bogs on the East Coast. It's also situated near a jewel-like lake, and of historic note is the USGS baseline used for surveying coastal Maine in the 19th century. Lastly, a genuine Maine shore dinner of steamers and lobsters will round out the day." So the purpose of these outings was to foster camaraderie among the team and their families, a tradition that continues today. But it was also to scout out the site for a potential placement for a large-scale interferometer. So when they arrived at the place of interest, the team walked the land and set up basic equipment to measure the seismic activity of the space. The LIGO team was also interested in the Columbia site because they thought it was flat. That is either continuously sloping or actually in flat. But it also had to be quiet, sufficiently large to accommodate the large-scale interferometer. And the site was of particular interest because they believed it was only owned by one entity, which is Jasper, an industrial blueberry farmer. If you eat frozen blueberries, you'll recognize this name quite readily. So one of the practices Weiss engaged in outside the lab was to inform himself about the sites through newspapers. So tucked away in the files created over 30 years ago, Weiss clipped an article providing insights as to why Jasper may have welcomed the use of the land for the purposes of allowing for fundamental physical science research. So the clippings revealed that in 1980s, this was a period of great tension between the Micmac, who migrated from Canada to this area of Maine for the blueberry harvest, and the local blueberry producers, or those who owned the land. In 1983, Maine had passed a law that granted state assistance to anyone who was deemed needy and had not collected benefits in the last 6 months. This, in combination with a 1794 treaty between Canada and the United States, allowed the Micmac to claim U.S. citizenship by merely crossing the border from the U.S. or from Canada into the U.S., making them eligible for the state assistance. Exacerbating the issue was a 30-year low blueberry price season in 1984. So these drastic price drops resulted from the surplus in this commodity because of the introduction of DuPont's Valpar. It's a herbicide that killed everything but the wild blueberry plants and allowed for the introduction of mechanical rakers in flat areas. And it ultimately was displacing the human harvesters. So to add flame to the fire, advocates continued the calls for housing, water, and better working condition for the Micmac during harvesting season, but they had been demanding this for years. However, blueberry companies were reluctant to provide housing, electricity, running water because of this incurred cost, and the harvest season was only a few weeks long. So the Jasper president stand was, quote, "No one is forcing the migrants to come here. We provide cabins, and many like to come here and camp out." This statement aligns with that from the U.S. director of Cherryfield Foods, the second largest blueberry company wild blueberry company in the United States, who was of the opinion, quote, "The government is supplying too many benefits." On the other hand, the state of Maine recognized that if benefits were not provided, people would go hungry, as the Micmac lived in the state in a state of precarity due to dependence on the welfare while in the U.S. and also while in Canada. So in addition, companies that did provide housing often failed to comply with the relevant regulations of the U.S. Labor Department, claiming that an investment of $250,000 was too great for a harvesting period that only lasted a few weeks out of the year. So with this knowledge from the site visit and also the newspapers, the team realized two things. The land was likely owned by multiple owners or had multiple claims for multiple people and contained granite upthrust, indicating the potential need for blasting parts of the site. So this is seen as cost increases, questioning whether the site was actually ideal. So focusing on the landowners first, every land transfer, especially an acquisition by institutional actors such as MIT, requires that the land be clear and free of any encumbrances in the legal sense. That is, the chain of title should be established with no competing legal claims to the land before acquisition takes place. Thus, first steps in the process is to perform a title search. And when an MIT attorney performed this process, 12 different entities were revealed as landowners instead of one. Weiss dealt with this over 10-fold increase in estimated disturbances by becoming a hybrid between a community organizer and a physicist while working on the cosmic background explorer and the future generation of gravitational wave detectors, and also his regular teaching load. So first, and under the recommendation of the MIT Real Estate Office, he and his team reached out to a Maine attorney, and the attorney then arranged for an initial town hall style meeting in the area, targeting the relevant landowners and local residents through announcements in local newspapers to discuss the project and formulate and ease concerns. This was a time when Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, also colloquially referred to as Star Wars, was put forward. So the locals were very worried about lasers being housed in their backyards. So locals were not initially thrilled with this project. And Weiss had to figure out how to communicate the goals of the experiment and the laboratory. And the key is in this drawing that we see between the attorney on the left and Weiss on the right. So Weiss developed a visual and then worked with a local artist to create drawings to assist local residents in visualizing the site. Of notable importance is the blown up portion inside the tube of the interferometer. This image is as if we were slicing through the tube and looking inside. And it illustrates the activities that would be occurring underneath the cover of the interferometer arm. So Weiss developed this first visual where a man is seen sitting in the tube close to a laser beam to dispel concerns generated by the SDI program. This hand drawing is a mediating device, drawn on grid paper, found in abundance in any science or engineering lab, with specifications of the instrument size at a level slightly higher than a block diagram. In this drawing, there are elements unfamiliar to the typical engineer or experimental diagram. Namely, Weiss has drawn in a person. We can see his facial features. Anyone who's seen engineering drawings, there rarely are no people in them. And if there are, they're usually stick figures. But this figure has a face. So in addition, it shows that the interferometer is hidden from the surface. And so the precious blueberry shrubs are protected. And then also in the background, we see that the local nature, including animals, are protected as well. Weiss has identified cows, moose, bears, and coyotes that regularly visit the site and will be able to do so even with LIGO operating there. So Weiss worked with an artist to incorporate this concept into the drawing that could be used to allow local residents to conceptualize such a large instrument in their home landscape. So we have the drawing here. The red coloring, it used to be purple, indicates the blueberry barrens, which are rendered as semi-transparent to reduce the uncertainty of what's happening in the interferometer itself. And so with this drawing, the town hall was not a dull affair. So Weiss and Selson both recounted a Maine lobsterman who expressed his opposition to the project during this gathering. In expressing his discontent, he had a sophisticated understanding of the noise concerns of the gravitational wave physicists, and he threatened that he would, quote, screw up the experiment. His brother, who lived in California, who happened to also know that LIGO was considering a site there as well, he claimed that he and his brother, quote, would drop a sledgehammer at the same time near the two sites and mimic a gravitational wave signal to fool the LIGO team. Weiss's response was that the seismometers installed on both sites would detect such ground shaking events, allowing LIGO to veto them as gravitational wave candidates. LIGO needs two sites in order to rule out local disturbances. If you have a gravitational wave and the sites are far enough apart, the gravitational wave will appear at both sites, and you can rule that out as being, in fact, a gravitational wave after a lot of analysis, and not being local noise. If you see a disturbance at only one of the sites, that indicates that it's likely local noise and not a gravitational wave. So overall, Weiss had no reservations about sharing the details of the physics and the technology of the instrument with the local residents. And this exchange between him and the lobsterman led many people at the town hall meeting to lend their support to the building of the detector there on the site. So due to the success of the meeting, attended by over 60 individuals, it eased the concerns, and additional town hall meetings were conducted. So Weiss was no longer just a physicist, but he was also a community organizer. So the problems did not stop with the lobsterman. So while some landowners started lending their support to gravitational wave detectors, there was one landowner, Renee Cotton, who held out. She held out in many creative ways that earned her the title as the most difficult landowner. So in an effort to resolve this situation, Weiss invited Cotton, who lived fairly close to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where MIT is located. She lived in Wellesley, to meet with him at MIT. So Cotton's resistance manifested itself in unique ways. She insisted that the potential site contained human archaeological remains from 7000 BCE. If we go and look at the archaeologist report further, it states that Cotton reported a rumored site on her property near the existing house on the basis of her late husband's testimony about an amateur archaeologist who allegedly found artifacts there. However, when they dug test pits to investigate this claim, the claim went unsubstantiated. So Cotton had many concerns beyond this, including the soil, the moraines, disturbing the granite. That would happen if they had to build a long tunnel. She also wanted to know how the tunnel would be filled upon termination of the project, because she was concerned that Cherry Fill Foods, another blueberry production company, would use the tunnel for a long-desired irrigation system that she had been resisting for years. She was also concerned about the demands of electrical power that would be created with the project, and this is likely related to the tension I mentioned earlier between the Micmac and the local blueberry producers, and she questioned whether the site would allow access to hunters who shoot up everything in sight. It turns out that the LIGO sites getting shot at continues to be a problem that has to be dealt with today, so it's very interesting. Lastly, Cotton was concerned that if she leased the land to LIGO, the property value would go up and thus increase her taxes. So she had a very sophisticated and nuanced way of thinking about situating LIGO on her property and in the area. So eventually, Cotton entered into lease negotiations with LIGO that were facilitated by the attorney because the site was shown not to contain archaeological artifacts, and she required provisions such as no laser warfare be conducted on the site, only peaceful and non-military scientific research would be conducted there. And when the attorney tried to leave open the option to allow institutions other than MIT and Caltech, because as we know today, the LIGO scientific collaboration consists of numerous schools across the world and numerous institutions. Ms. Cotton felt if there was anyone beyond MIT and Caltech, there could be no governmental entities involved. And this came with a note from the attorney stating that she was concerned about eminent domain seizure of her land. So there were additional efforts to understand not just the surface of the land, but also above and below the surface. And I think it's, when you were thinking about this, you should imagine that our existence, we are very aware of what's on the surface of land, but we really don't know what's going on beneath the surface that we stand on. And often I would argue we don't look up to see what's happening above us. So an aerial survey was commissioned in 1986 to obtain a better understanding of the fluctuation of the elevation of the land. And Weiss realized that the topography maps were incorrect. So using the survey, he was able to work with engineers to determine where there were granite upthrusts and what would need to be excavated in order to create arms that were straight for the laser light. So we can see that in the photos to the left and the right, how the land is sloping upwards and it kind of undulates. And then the photo in the middle shows that granite upthrust, and those were peppered throughout the sites. And such features would require tunneling at some points of the arm, such as the arm would have to weave above and below the surface of the land. And knowledge of what was below the surface was also important because it relates to vibrations. So you can imagine vibrations traveling through water have a different effect than vibrations traveling through granite, and compare that to vibrations traveling through a sandy soil. And so we see these sort of difference in characteristics at the Hanford site in Washington, which is in a high desert, and the Livingston site in Louisiana, which is on the edge of the sort of wetlands or bayou area. So archaeological artifacts, in addition to those claimed by Ms. Cotton, were found on the surface of a portion of the site where they were going to, where they wanted to lay the interferometer arm, and this land was owned by Cherryfield Foods. So one of the team members described what they saw as an ancient camp based on the placement and type of artifacts. And due to local law, the team would now have to delay construction until they could figure out whether that was a historic site. So after boring 367 holes and shifting through the soil, artifacts near the path of the interferometer were only dated to 1850 to 1900. So it was just what was called a modern dump. So then no concern there. LIGO had made significant investments in this archaeological investigation, which was found not to be of trouble, but in doing that investigation, they gained more knowledge about what was below the surface. In reviewing this episode in LIGO's site selection history, I have shown many activities and areas of expertise that physicists here, Weiss and his team, have gained beyond the lab. These include using maps, understanding maps that do not mirror the landscape, visiting the site and reading the landscape to understand it, accounting for and gaining buy-in from local landowners, occupants, and land uses, and understanding below surface features, including the soil composition and artifacts that might lay below. Understanding each of these translated into understandings that would be needed at the sites that were ultimately selected for LIGO, and these extra laboratory activities are thus of great importance. The light beam required a straight path of 2.5 miles at the current site, and in this case of Maine, understanding the maps to find candidate sites was needed. Also, an understanding of viewing the land to understand the nuances not reflected in the maps was also key, and we will see this over and over as they're narrowing down the candidates for the ultimate sites that are now used today. An understanding of the vibrational activity on the site is also required. The LIGO locations must be as still as possible. So one of the features that LIGO sought with the low population areas was to minimize daily background noise. After Columbia, Maine was seen as a sparsely populated area and then learned that it was not as sparsely populated as thought, is a lesson that translates to the consideration of the other candidate sites and the sites that are in existence today. So Projections and theorization of human activity is not quite understood until you actually see it happening on the site. Lastly, we are living humans who focus on the surface that we live on. And we, in order to understand vibrations on a site, we must look above and below the surface as well. So the main site called the physicist's attention to these extra areas that we normally do not consider. And it taught them how to decipher what lies below the surface and how that can affect the operation of the instrument. So in closing, I would argue, by expanding our understanding beyond the lab, we can learn additional key theorizations and features of the experiment, in this case, into how LIGO understands background noise as distinct from gravitational wave signals. And I would like to thank you for your time. Yeah, and I will hand it over to Daniel for Q&A.
Thanks so much, Tiffany. My wife is from Maine, incidentally, so I didn't realize it was going to be such a Maine story. It's really nice to hear about the blueberry farms and so on. I'm not sure that her family and so on will know about this interesting history of the LIGO, so we'll probably be discussing that later. Let me kick off with a question of my own. I'm quite interested in how the physicists understood the lineage of the experiment. I mean, like the natural lineage, of course, is with the Michelson-Morley experiment to detect the Earth's motion through the ether. Over 100 years before in the 1880s, and the experiment was done many times in the late 19th century and then on into the 20th. But it sounds to me like there's actually, like from your story, by looking beyond the actual instrument itself, that maybe there isn't so much in common at all. And the example that came to mind, which is quite an obscure one that I vaguely looked at when I was doing my PhD, is when French physicist Henri Victor Regnault in the 19th century was measuring the speed of sound in the subterranean pipes of Paris, right? So anyway, I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say about the way the physicists understood the lineage of the experiment.
Oh yeah, that's a really great question. So if you ask a LIGO physicist to describe the interferometer to you, they will naturally go to the Michelson and Morley experiment and describe that as definitely a precursor. But once you get to the site and you see the sophistication and complexity, we're moving from candles on a tray floating on a bed of mercury to something highly complex. But that spirit of the Michelson and Morley experiment and the conceptualization of harnessing light to make measurement is very alive and well in the imagination of LIGO physicists. But with that said, the controls and how you stabilize and make the instrument still, which I think were arguably not as complex, because I think the only sort of dampening feature was the pool of mercury that the interferometer for Michelson was floating on. LIGO has, when it comes to control theory and controlling the instrument, it's an explosion of concepts and complexity that is very, very incredible and sophisticated.
We had a comment coming through the chat from Russell Vernon that said that he found the double sledgehammer drop challenge particularly useful in the understanding of risk communication. I thought you might like to comment a little bit further on that one.
Oh yeah, that example is absolutely interesting. It's interesting because how do you communicate such an idea? Because if we are thinking about this, they're advocating for this idea in the 1980s. And if you go to someone and say, and tying back to your earlier question, because I think Michelson and Morley had a sensitivity measurement to 10 to the negative 13. And so in the 1980s, if you're saying you can get a level of sophistication of 10 to the negative 21, and it's such that vibrations matter across a distance of, 3,600 miles. And those who are learning about this and hearing it are imagining ways that the instrument could work. And then in this instance, a way that they could mess with the results is quite sophisticated. It shows how the physicists really were thinking about communicating their idea to the community to get buy-in, because that example shows full sort of meeting of the minds and consensus about what they're actually trying to do, which I find incredibly fascinating. Because if you think about it, LIGO is the largest project funded by NSF. So public buy-in is key because that's taxpayer dollars, and this example illustrates that. It also illustrates the many different scenarios that LIGO would later have to consider when it comes to noise. Because there are some really just interesting stories about the noise that they consider on each of the sites that relates to this lobster man's example.
I'm wondering also, again, like there's other historical examples that there's these interesting resonances with, like when they built the National Bureau of Standards in Germany in the late 19th century, like they had to move the site because of trains and trams and urban development. And the same thing happened in the United Kingdom as well with Kew Observatory and so on. I wonder to what extent those kinds of considerations were at play here as well, and whether or not the LIGO scientists placed, like a sort of a time, like an expectation of the amount of time that they would be able to be active in a particular area or something like that?
Oh yeah, this is also a great question. So there are kind of many phases of this understanding. So where they built the prototypes for the instrument in the 80s is very important. So the first one was at MIT, and it's 1.5 meters long. And if you've been to Cambridge, particularly when you're walking across Vassar Street and Massachusetts Avenue, you inevitably feel the rumbling of the T subway train beneath you. And this was going underneath their site when they were trying to test the prototype. So there's an instance where they even close off Vassar Street, which is unheard of because it's very busy, just to have a level of quietness. And this starts to give you a conceptualization of the time frame that's needed. When they originally started pitching the sites, they said 20 years. So how do you imagine what 20 years of noise will look like? And this is a sophistication that we get with the 1972 report that Weiss wrote, identifying all the different noise sources, and that conceptualized this longer time frame. But when we later get to the actual federal level site selection phase, and we think about sites like Hanford, so Hanford is on a nuclear reserve. So it actually has a population density of 0. And it turns out one of the arguments that I make in my dissertation is a site that's good for nuclear storage, because it has to be very stable and vibration free because you don't want an accident, happens to carry some of the same features that's needed for LIGO. And if you think about Hanford, right now, it's arguable that that's seen as more of a permanent site for storage of nuclear waste. So it's more static in the longer term than other sites that you would get that didn't have that on the site. And so the last part I would say is, as LIGO is making more detections, upgrading their instruments, this is a project that seems to be thought of as unbounded without time, but they have a compendium of all the different sources of noise that pop up on the site, so that they can more easily troubleshoot when there's something unexpected.
Yeah, that actually answers another question that came in through the chat about how long LIGO would be used. I mean, there's two ways. Maybe there's, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but there seems to be two ways of answering the question. Is one about, how long the site will last, and another about how long a given detector or experimental apparatus is going to be in place.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So I am not a LIGO spokesperson, but we can look at how the LIGO instrument has been used thus far. So the initial instrument that was put inside is initial LIGO. It's been updated or upgraded a few times, but we have additional projects that are starting to grow out of the wonderful work that LIGO has done. So there will be the Einstein telescope that will be placed in Northern Europe. We also have the Cosmic Explorer that's going to supposedly have 40-kilometer long arms. So we're getting upgrades on the system. We also have Kagra, which just became in operation in Japan. And then there's going to be a site, LIGO India. And then we also have LISA that will be in outer space. So this network will be working together, But you can see when you look at the white papers and the proposals, there is continual upgrade, because the more sensitive the instruments are, the further out in the universe we can listen for gravitational waves. So I think, at some point in the next 20, 30 years, we'll see more sophisticated instruments, and naturally, you could probably guess what will happen to some of the ones that are built today.
Of course, there's no lobstermen in outer space, but one of our postdoctoral fellows, Ruth Rand, has got a great question about conflict over cultural and environmental sensitivity, which she says seems, I quote, par for the course for astronomical observatory sighting. So could astronomers learn anything from LIGO and the episode that you've been presenting today?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's one that I have thought very much about in my doctoral research. One of the arguments that I put forward relates to Peter Gellison's concept of technical landscapes. It's these landscapes that are used for not necessarily natural uses, but more technical aspects. So they either become wastelands because it's for nuclear storage, or it's for production of commodities and chemicals. And there is a history in the land when you look at the way it's being used in a technical sense. So the two sites that LIGO has selected, or LIGO, NSF, Congress, the selection process involves so many different people. So, but looking at Hanford, the commodity there is really nuclear storage. It is a reservation site. It's a site that you can visit like the B reactor, for example, but it's not a site in which it's used every day by us in our everyday lives. As for the Livingston site, it's in the middle of a pine tree forest, and these pine trees are used for the production of pulpwood, for printer paper, toilet paper, paper towels. So it's been dedicated for over 100 years to this production of a commodity. So naturally, people weren't there. But if you go back in time, you'll find conflicts and sort of how the land was owned. So for example, the Hanford site, has a history. If you read Kate Brown's Plutopia, talks about the original indigenous owners of the land, and how you can still see the imprint in the landscape. And it's sort of this history is used to sort of sanitize this very toxic site. And you can see the same in the history of Louisiana, because before pine trees, there was cypress, and before cypress, there were cotton plantations. So there is always, when you look at the technical aspect, we focus on what it's technically producing, and then we can see a larger history in regards to these conflicts in a historic sense that aren't necessarily visible now. But by reading the landscape and knowing its history, we can reveal what's happened in the past.
Ruth is thanking you, by the way, for putting Lisa on her map. She works on the history of space junk, and just says that she somehow hadn't heard of Lisa. So, is there a time? You could say a little bit more about Lisa? Like, is there a sort of time frame, and are private companies like SpaceX involved in working with the physicists in like thinking creatively about how to get this thing up there, or?
Yeah, I don't want to misspeak. So my caveat to what I'm about to say is that. So Lisa is mostly an effort out of the Max Planck Institute for Gravitational Physics, and a collaboration with other universities in Northern Europe. They've done a proof of concept for the individual components. So it's 3 components that will be placed in space and float, and they're supposed to detect sort of the lower frequency gravitational wave signals that we can't do here on Earth, because ours are land-based and there's too much surface vibration. You can't get the sensitivity to detect those. And I think the time frame is the 2030s to have it be operational, but don't quote me on that.
So you mentioned earlier in your talk as well that there was some other, this was just after the animation that you showed us, and I think, or just before, and there was some other aspects of the physics that you said that we could ask you about, that you could elaborate on a bit further.
Oh yeah, so there are many requirements for what makes an ideal site for LIGO. So with the caveat that we're given the sites that we have here on Earth. So you have to have flat land or constant or steadily sloping land so that the laser light beam is straight. You have to have low vibrations because the daily background activity, the lower you can make it, the better for LIGO. The other thing is you have to have 2 sites. That's not necessarily the case, but it makes it easier to discern gravitational wave signals from local noise because a gravitational wave literally warps the Earth like this. This is an exaggeration. So it will inevitably appear in more than one site. And you want it to be far enough away so that the local disturbances of one site can be discerned as such, and gravitational waves that appear at both sites can also be discerned in that way. So other things that affect LIGO, you need to have a sophisticated understanding of the noise. For example, the 2 sites doesn't quite get you out of all local noise. For example, if there's a lightning storm in the middle of the United States and it's severe enough, it can cause sort of disturbances of both sites. So they have to have a sophisticated understanding of all of these various noise sources so that they can make these distinctions. Yeah, so those are kind of some of the additional things that LIGO has to consider.
And one final question about you. When should we expect the PhD to be completed? Or do you have papers or some other work in the pipeline that you will publish your results in?
Yeah, so paper is in the works as we speak. So hopefully that will be submitted within the next semester and you guys will see that soon. As for graduation, we're hoping May 2022. With that said, with the pandemic, it poses some interesting factors. So, you know, there's a little bit of a balancing act that goes on with that right now.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Tiffany. We'll give you all a virtual round of applause. It's hard to congratulate speakers and thank them in the usual way. So I'll just say to everybody that we'll return in January on a bi-weekly basis this time with a focus on the human biological sciences. And I just want to wish you all a safe and happy holidays, safe driving today if you're in the Northeast Coast, and all good things to everybody for 2021. Thanks very much for joining us today.